All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight. My name is Sean Conley, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director at the Arch Street Meeting House Reservation Trust. This evening's presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube page and our website. Before we begin this evening's event, I'd like to go over some technology-related instructions. As there are many of you here, we've disabled the audio and video functions to minimize accidental distractions, background noises, but there are still ways for you to engage. Kayla will be monitoring the chat for any questions, comments that you have. Chat function should be used to ask questions of Wes throughout his presentation. You're welcome to type your questions throughout, and then Wes will be answering those questions at the end of the presentation. Please direct any technical questions you have to Kayla rather than all attendees. This event that was offered as a suggested donation, for those of you who'd like to continue your support of Arch Street Meeting House, Kayla will place a link to our donation page in the chat box, and Arch Street Meeting House greatly appreciates your support and you, the audience, for making these programs possible. So I'd like to introduce our presenter, Wes Daniels. Wes is the Williams R. Roger Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College. He lives in Greensboro, North Carolina, with his wife, Emily, and their 3 children. He has a Master's of Theology and a PhD in Intercultural Studies from Fuller Theological Seminary. Wes teaches Quaker Studies at Guilford College and is taught at Earlham School of Religion, George Fox Seminary, Woodbrook Quaker Study Center, and Pendle Hill. He is widely published in Quaker publications, including Quaker Studies, Quaker Religious Thought, Friends Journal, and more. He is the author of Resisting Empire, the Book of Revelation as Resistance, and A Convergent Model of Renewal, Remixing the Quaker Tradition in Participatory Culture. He is an associate editor on the Brill Research Perspectives in Quaker Studies and the co-editor in the forthcoming book, The Quaker World. Wes, we are thrilled to have you here this evening. The topic sounds really exciting, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be with you this evening. My name is Wes Daniels. I use he, him pronouns. As Sean mentioned, I live in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm a member of First Friends meeting here, and I'm glad to be sharing this talk, Liturgies of Empire, Liturgies of Resistance, Quaker Faith and Practice in an Age of Empire. If you would join me for a moment of silence before we begin. All right, thank you. Okay, so just a couple pieces about me. This is my family here. I'm married to Emily. We've been married for over 20 years, and we have 3 children. Lily is our oldest, May is our middle daughter, our son Clem, and our rescue dog Magnolia. As was mentioned, I'm a teacher and work with college-age students or here at Guilford College, and also have a small coffee roasting business just on the side for fun. I am going to talk a little bit about the Book of Revelation this evening. It's not the center of the talk, but I'm going to pull in some pieces. So I'm going to be drawing from my most people following the nonviolent teachings of Jesus resisted and survived empire in the first century. This really has the study of Revelation and kind of that perspective, that it's not about the end of the world, but it's about how these communities in the first century resisted empire, has taken me down a rabbit hole about how empire shows up in the Hebrew texts, in the Christian texts of the Bible, and also how it has shown up in the early Quaker movement and obviously in our time today, in our lives today. So this evening, I want to share with you what might be considered sort of an opening chapter, maybe to the next, if there was a next book after this, this might be where we would start. So the early Quaker movement started, as many of you know, in the 1640s as a kind of radical reformation of the Christian church. Co-founders George Fox and Margaret Fell were among those who were disaffected and disillusioned by the church of the time. And they set out to recreate a movement, a community, or a church, whatever you sort of like to think of it as. But they understood what they were doing, in the words of William Penn, as primitive Christianity revived. Why? Why were they doing this? I think, maybe to oversimplify it a little bit, is that since the time of Constantine, the church had gotten in bed with empire. The church, which was first born among the poor and the victims of empire, had become a purveyor of empire. Craig Carter says this: Christendom is the concept of Western civilization as having a religious arm, the church, and a secular arm, the civil government, both of which are united in their adherence to Christian faith, which is seen as the so-called soul of Europe or the West. The essence of the idea is the assertion that Western civilization is Christian. Within this Christian civilization, the state and the church have different roles to play. But since membership in both is coterminous, both can be seen as aspects of one unified reality, Christendom. So when Fox, this is the context in which early Quakers, of course, were getting their start. And when Fox claimed that there is even one Christ Jesus who can speak to thy condition, he is claiming more than that early friends could have a direct relationship with God. In this statement alone is the foundation of the undoing of Christendom. There is even one Christ Jesus who can speak to thy condition. The religion of empire thrives on artifices, mediators, budgets, and an elite and educated class to justify actions done on behalf of God. In this simple claim, a theological battle broke out between the powers of empire and the power of the simple teachings of Jesus spoken through the early friends. This message was born in the north of England, far away from the center of the British Empire in London, resonating and spreading among the poor and working class. Yes, there were folks like Margaret Fell, the Penningtons, and others who were more educated and had means, strengthening this multi-class coalition. But make no mistake, the early friends of Jesus were like the literal friends of Jesus in the Gospels, a movement of the poor, dispossessed, downtrodden, and victims of empire. Practices like the priesthood of all believers, the inward sacraments, meeting and expectant waiting worship, and collective decision-making are practices no boss or person in power would create. They are practices that follow from the logic of the poor and people who know what it is to resist empire. Early Quakerism makes far more sense to me if I understand it as an early poor people's campaign, seeking a movement that resists empire and creating practices, theologies, and standards rooted in powerful practices that enabled them to do just that. In other words, the practices born out of the early Quaker movement, I believe, are within the great tradition of resistance that stems all the way back to the prophetic, anti-imperial aspects of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, and were only conceivable due to the logic and experience of those who in that time were themselves on the edges of empire. Because of this, these practices that emerged in that time helped to form a community that was able to resist the religion of empire in many, but not all ways. It is to this formation that these liturgies of empire and liturgies of resistance that I want to turn to next. As a part of, I want to do a little piece of framing before we get into the kind of the main subject. So I'm going to be using the language of religion of empire, the religion of creation. I'm going to be talking about empire a little bit. So let me say how I'm using that and what I mean by that. This comes from the work of another person named Wes Howard Brooke. In his book, Come Out, My People. It's a really great book that I highly recommend if you're interested in this subject. Here's what he says about the two religions. There are two religions we can see arise from within the biblical text. Although this risks oversimplification, let's call them the religion of creation and the religion of empire. That is, we can understand one of the Bible's religions to be grounded in the experience of and ongoing relationship with the Creator God, leading to a covenantal bond between that God and God's people for the blessing and abundance of all people and all creation. That's the religion of creation. The other, while sometimes claiming to be grounded in that same God, is actually a human invention used to justify and legitimate attitudes and behaviors that provide blessing and abundance for some at the expense of others. So you have the religion of creation, grounded in that ongoing relationship with Creator God, that is covenantal and focused on abundance and blessing for all people and all creation. And here's some images that I think of when I think of the kind of religion of creation, struggling for the abundance of all people and all creation. Or the religion of empire, to be grounded in that same God, or claims to be grounded in that same God, uses that same God to justify and legitimate attitudes that provide blessing for some at the expense of others. And I usually say at the expense of everyone else. Right? And so religion of empire, images of using God, providing blessing for some at the expense of others. Now, this is a little bit of a definition of empire. We could spend a whole talk just unpacking what we mean by empire. We'll just take this as our jumping off point from Hart and Negri, who are in cultural studies. Empire is emerging today as the center that supports the globalization of productive networks and casts its widely inclusive net to try to envelop all power relations within its world order. And yet at the same time, it deploys a powerful police function against the new barbarians and the rebellious slaves who threaten its order. So for Wes Howard Brooke, knowing that for thousands of years, humans, stemming all the way back to the Hebrew Bible and Christian Testament, for thousands of years, humans have struggled against the powers and principalities or empire, makes the Bible more relevant and these stories more relevant, not less. So I'm going to be drawing a little bit from some of biblical studies in what I present to you today as well. So now that we've sort of framed what we mean a little bit by the religion of empire and the religion of creation, I want to get into how we think about liturgies of each of these two religions. So what is liturgy? Here's some images that may come to mind when we think about liturgy? What do you think of when I say the word liturgy? What are characteristics that you would expect from a liturgical service? What if I asked you, what would a liturgy of empire look like? What would you say if I asked you what liturgies of resistance might look like? It's another more Quaker inspired image. In his book, The Liturgies of Quakerism, Quaker scholar Pink Dandelion defines liturgy as the work of the people. It is something that is done, acted upon, or performed by the people, which, as it is enacted, makes them into a people, a community, a movement. Therefore, liturgy can be used for positive or negative formation. It dulls hearts as much as it can open them. It can stunt imaginations as much as enliven them. Liturgy can wake people up or make them content with the way things are. In this way, there are liturgies all around us, and even for Quakers, which is Pink Dandelion's argument in his book, Liturgies of Quakerism. Even communal silence has a contour that shapes and forms its people. It is a liturgy. I think when we talk about liturgy, we often think of the Episcopal Church or Catholic Mass. Being in Mass and singing songs or responsive prayers. Liturgy as the work of the people is more than saying a responsive prayer. It's understanding liturgy as being more than a responsive prayer, more than singing together. But these practices can be powerful forms of liturgy as well. We think back to anti-war movements and the civil rights movement as two obvious examples where these kinds of practices were used for creating cohesion and movement building. What communities sing and how they pray matters because what we humans talk about and what we say matter. The language people use to create worlds and communities matter because they shape imaginations, possibilities, and limitations. Ultimately, liturgy as communal language shapes practices and who we become. In my book, Resisting Empire, I lay out two ways in which the book of Revelation unmasks two types of liturgy rooted in these definitions that we're working with. So let's take a quick look. We're not going to spend too much time in Revelation, but I want to just give you a little taste. And if this tastes good and you're interested, you can we can follow up later, or you can read more. It's in the book. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know much about the book of Revelation, but certainly kind of taking it in this more liberatory perspective that I'm trying to do. In Revelation 11 through 15, we see that there's three scenes of worship that take place. In between those scenes of worship, there is dramatic conflict symbolized by a dragon and a woman, a pregnant woman, Michael and angels, followed by the dragon and beasts in chapter 13. I think the author of Revelation is showing us that the two religions for a second. All right, in Revelation 13, everybody's favorite passage, the mark of the beast, it says this: Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wounds had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of earth, telling them to make an image of the beast, or for the beast, that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So there's a lot in here, and I'm not going to try to unpack all of it, but what I want to draw your attention to is this reoccurring language of the image of the beast, which is, the beast is a stand-in for empire, and how it is performing these signs in order to get the inhabitants of earth to sort of believe in it, to worship it. And the image of the beast is, of course, in contrast to another very similar phrase, image of God, from the book of Genesis in the first chapter. And so we see, again, image of God, image of beast, kind of juxtaposed to one another, and that the image of the beast has its own kind of formation, its own worship that it's trying to get people to follow. And if they don't worship it, they are killed. And we have lots of people who have been a part of the traditions of resistance throughout human history who have refused to worship empire and have been killed. So this is not like, this is not like hard to understand what is going on here, right? So this is what Wes Howard Brooks says about this passage. Then I saw, this war, the conflict between these two religions, took the form of ritual crucifixions. This is how the empire is responding to those who resist it. Arena contests with lions and other public spectacles of execution. John, who's believed to be the author of Revelation, his insight is that these are not merely political acts, but liturgical acts as well. The courtrooms with robed magistrates, the choreographed risings and sittings, collective responses, and other ritual acts are all a part of this liturgical demeanor of empire. So we're just trying to make the argument that empire has its own kind of liturgy. And Wes Howard Brooks is pointing out what that looked like in the first century and what the communities in Revelation, or who are reading that letter that we call Revelation, what they were facing when they were resisting empire. This is what they faced. Okay. So I want to dig in a little bit deeper and get a little bit more specific on liturgies of empire. I do want to say that I'm going to be kind of talking about some sensitive material. So if at some point it's too much or you need to step away for a minute, feel free to mute me or step away. This will only be, a few minutes, but I do want to talk a little bit about Nuremberg rallies, and I am going to say a little bit about lynchings. So just to give you a sense of where this is going and thinking about liturgies of empire. I'm not going to get super descriptive or anything like that, but I am going to be talking about these two subjects. So I want to talk about liturgies liturgies of empire in the context of a Nuremberg rally. James Allison, who's a queer Catholic theologian, has an amazing article that I've read multiple times and still trying to absorb it, called Worship in a Violent World, where he essentially is arguing something very similar, and you can see where I'm sort of drawing from it as we go along, where he's saying there's essentially two kinds of worship. There is a Nuremberg style of worship and an un-Nuremberg style of worship, religion of empire and religion of creation. So in this violent world, in the context of violent or Nuremberg styled worship, he gets into some of how we might kind of think about this. He says, first, we need to not just think of it as a secular rally or a godless get-together of people who are rooting for the Nazi cause. No, we should see the rally as a kind of gathering for worship, where the rally functions liturgically for the purposes of the empire. He writes, let's see, I think I have this. No, sorry. He writes this: the liturgical organizers of the Nuremberg rallies knew exactly what they were doing and did it remarkably well. He goes on to explain how the rally functioned and what it did and a little bit of what it might have been like. It brought people together and united them in worship. So this is James Allison writing this. You provide regular rhythmic music and marching. You enable them to see lots of people in uniform, people who have already lost a certain individuality and become symbols. You see temples, you see statues, you see there's collective responses, there's special robes. You give them a song to sing. You build them up with the reasons for their togetherness, a reason based on a common racial heritage. You inflame them with tales of past woe and reminders of past confusion when they were caused to suffer by some shame being imposed upon them, the tailwind of which woe is still in their midst. You keep them waiting and the pressure building up. All this gradually serves to take people out of themselves. The normally restrained become passionate. Unfriendly neighbors find themselves looking at each other anew, as though they're growing in a new sense of togetherness and community. Then, after the buildup, the Führer appears preferably brought in by means of a helicopter or airplane, which has been seen from beneath by the gradually effervescing crowd. And before long, the apotheosis takes place, and he is in their midst. They are already riveted. The waiting helped prepare that. They are united in fascination with this extraordinary person to whom they have handed over the task of being their chief liturgist. And he does not disappoint. With a few deft words and gestures, he conjures up the mood of those present, pointing to the huge gathering as a sign of a new unity, which is overcoming the pains and humiliations of the past. Pains and humiliations caused by the enemies from afar, and more important, by readily identifying enemies who are much closer at hand. He need say no more. But none of these will stand in the way of the heroic victory which this new gathering, this huge unanimity portends. A victory which presages a new world order, without which the presence of those enemies within, one where only the good and the pure, such as those who are gathered here, will remain. The Führer is even able to thank God, whose providence has allowed him, unworthy servant of the Volk, to expand his life sacrificially on behalf of his people in his daily work of leading them into this new world. By this stage, of course, the crowd is delirious, outside themselves, united in love and adoration of their Führer, and of course, ready to do whatever he asks them. On their way home that evening, though they may not notice it, part of the magic of the day will have rubbed off on them. They will look at the Jew from across the road in a different light. He will have lost personality in their eyes and become a representative of the sort of thing the Führer had suggested. They will be that much closer to turning a blind eye to his disappearance, to agreeing that old Mr. Silverstein, the cobbler, is indeed a threat to society. James Allison writes, to the divinization of the one, there corresponds the demonization of the other, which is the dehumanization of them all. The lifting up of one requires a repositioning of the other. So here's a few points that I want to zero in on that I feel are specifically important about what I just read to you as it pertains to thinking about the Liturgy of Empire. So Liturgy of Empire extracts us from the present moment, then removes us from the suffering of our neighbor and lulls us to sleep. It is the opposite of being present. It is focused on togetherness at all costs, especially togetherness at the expense of the differentiation of the individual. This includes in-group and out-group, or us versus them. It includes shared clothing, symbols, language, songs can be extremely important. Linguistically, you hear this phrase, phrase is similar to, nothing will stop the coming victory of this new unity, this new togetherness. There is a clear leader who uses that power to divide in the name of unity and plays to a sense of persecution and suffering caused by the enemies. This individual is always ordained by the God of the religion of empire. It contains a constant building up into a frenzy, into sensationalism, that building up is meant to extract and dull and is building up over against some other group. It distracts us by excitement, by sensationalism, and spectacle that feels good to be on the inside of, but keeps us from actually knowing what is going on. And ultimately, it drives us towards seeing the sacrifice of others through the scapegoat mechanism as a necessary part of what we do in order to maintain peace. So the natural next question is, I think, where do we see this in our time? I'm just going to share a few slides and some images that I don't think will be too shocking for any of you. But again, thinking about how we're sort of building up into a frenzy over and against some other group, some scapegoat, that if we could only get rid of them, then we would finally have peace. These are images from the impeachment trial, and thinking about the kind of the rising and the sitting and the highly choreographed pieces of a courtroom and how that works. Now, I want to say something about lynching. James Cone, who's considered to be the father of Black liberation theology, calls lynching our country's national crime. And it is an example of how liturgies of empire have worked in our country. In his really amazing book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone describes this history and the emergence of lynching from the extra-legal punishment sanctioned by the community against people like Mexicans, Native Americans, and Chinese generally referring to whipping, shooting, stabbing, and hanging, to something that became and not just here in the South, but in nearly every state in this country. This is not to mention the ongoing lynchings of those today who have died through police brutality and white vigilantism. Some of their names are Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Mayor Rice, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many more. This is what James Cone writes. By the 1890s, lynching fever gripped the South, spreading like cholera, as white communities were made blacks their primary target and torture their focus. I realized I said I wasn't going to get too descriptive, so I'm going to skip over a little bit of this. Often as many as 10 to 20,000 men, women, and children would attend a lynching. It was a family affair, a ritual celebration of white supremacy where women and children were often given the first opportunity to torture. Postcards were made from the photographs taken of black victims with white lynchers, and other onlookers smiling as they struck a pose for the camera. Cone describes these events as being shot through with religious language. White people dressed in their Sunday best. Local pastors presided over these services. Other liturgical elements that reflected a liturgy rooted in a violent God who demands sacrifice. So what about liturgies of resistance? I'm going to turn back to Revelation for a second, if you don't mind. In Revelation 5, there is an image of a lamb that was slain. The lamb whose blood was shed by the Roman state. The lamb is a metaphor for Jesus, who we know was himself poor, a brown-skinned person of Palestinian descent, and as we have talked about already, was himself a scapegoat and a victim of empire. Jesus was lynched by the Roman Empire in a similar way that African Americans have been lynched by white people in this country. His body did not matter to the powers that killed him, and in fact, he represented a threat to the coming victory of Caesar. This image of the lamb that was slain is not only important to the author of Revelation, who uses this phrase 28 times throughout the letter. It is the main and most important metaphor used in the letter. It was also very important to early Quakers' understanding of resistance to empire. With friends developing their theology of nonviolent resistance that they refer to as the War of the Lamb, which is a direct reference to this imagery here in Revelation. What I think Revelation is trying to unmask for its readers is that the scapegoat mechanism, the rallying against some wicked other in order to create peace or maintain peace, the being caught up and extracted from the present suffering of others into a sense of our own persecution and victimhood is how empire functions. It is how empire creates its social boundaries. It's how empire passes on its values or its morals. It's how it displays who is in and who is out. This predictable pattern of empire continues from all the way back then to this day, today. It is also what cost Jesus his life, and therefore solidarity with victims of empire is inscribed into the very heart of the Christian story. Juxtaposed with the image of the beast, the violent god of empire who demands sacrifice and worship at the threat of death, is the lamb that was slain is yet alive, revealed as the innocent victim of empire. In other words, Revelation is not about unmasking liturgies, is not just about unmasking liturgies of empire, but about offering an alternative liturgy of resistance. In Revelation 7, we are given one such picture of this kind of community and liturgy, one that is centered around the innocent victims of empire. So here's what Revelation 7 says. After this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb." And all the angels stood around the throne, and the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, singing, "Amen, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen." This is obviously a worship scene. Okay, the rest of this says, "Then one of the elders addressed me, saying," me being the author of Revelation, saying, "Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from?" I said to him, "Sir, you are the one that knows." Then he said, "These are the ones who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And for this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple, and the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them forever. Shelter them. They will hunger no more. They will thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will be their guide. He will guide them to springs of water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. You know, there's a lot in that passage as well, but that passage says something different to a group of people who are poor and who are victims of empire than it does to people who are in power and reading it as though it's being said to them. So the liturgies of resistance the liturgy of resistance roots itself in a different vision of who God is. This God is a God of abundance for all creation and all people, a life force, a healing and reconciling force, one who prioritizes the poor and most vulnerable and suffers with those suffering. This God is nonviolent in nature and stands with the disinherited in order to build an alternative vision that Revelation calls the multitude. So the multitude really stands out to me as this kind of alternative community, alternative vision of what the world can look like. No one can count its size, people from every nation, all tribes, all languages. This is an extremely inclusive vision of this community, this body from the first century. And that it centers these victims of empire is doubly powerful to me. So what can we extract or kind of take away from this passage and what it says about the liturgies of resistance? First, I'm going to use this language of fusion coalition. I see the multitude as a fusion coalition that no one could count. This is a first century version of what it looks like to build a movement that is inclusive and diverse. When people are willing to join together with others who are unlike them to stand in the stream of resistance against empire. Fusion coalition building has its history in Southern organizing strategies where blacks and whites joined forces in order to advance a new political vision for the world. The goal is not to just organize with people you agree with, but with people from diverse organizations and backgrounds who you can work together with to create a new world, even if they aren't all in the same group or don't agree on all matters. The multitude is an ancient version of this kind of coalition building as a means of resisting empire. The second thing I see in this text from Revelation on the multitude is that the resurrected lamb that was slain is at the center of their gathering. Resurrection, as you know, in the Christian narrative, isn't some evacuation theology, nor is it some grand paycheck for all our sufferings. It is itself the way in which Jesus demonstrates with his life that empire does not have the last say on death. Empire wants us to be desensitized to death. We are used to spectacles of execution, violence, brutalization. Just think about all the mass shootings and the repeated images of African Americans and other people of color being brutalized, and all the interviews and news shows about it. We turn violence into memes to share it over and over and over again. Throughout our culture, whether in media, social media algorithms, or our contemporary politics, there is a normalization process of the culture of death that we are all subject to. Dorothy Sowell, a feminist theologian, German feminist theologian, says, "What I can do in the context of the rich world is minute and without risk in comparison with the great traditions of resistance." The issue is not to venerate heroes, but together to offer resistance actively and deliberately and in very diverse situations against becoming habituated to death, something that is one of the spiritual foundations of the culture of the first world. And she was writing this back in the 70s, so you'll have to forgive the first world language. Resurrection is resistance to this culture of death. It is saying no. We will not become habituated to death. We will not fear it, and we can see through it. We refuse to accept the way the world is now because we know that another world is possible and is already at hand. This perhaps is one of the most striking features about the liturgies of resistance that Revelation offers. There is no build-up to a sacrifice. There is instead an understanding that the scapegoat mechanism is a sham and a tool of the empire. The lamb slain yet alive is a symbol of the rejection of becoming habituated to death, celebrating instead what early friends understood well, which enabled them to have a robust liturgy of resistance. That Christ is already present, that the beloved community is already unfolding, that the multitude is already here. Another key aspect of the liturgies of resistance in this text is that the victims of the empire are also at the center with the Lamb. I can't stress, I think this might be the most important part of what I'm trying to say, or certainly what I think Revelation is saying. Another key aspect of the liturgy of resistance in this text is that the victims of empire are also at the center with the Lamb. If you reread that text, you'll see that they are there in the center with the Lamb. Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from? Sir, you are the only one that knows. These are the ones who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. A liturgy of resistance names and lifts up the victims of empire and centers their stories, amplifies their voices, and works to discern the ways in which we can be in solidarity with those who are innocent victims like the Lamb. As friends in this country who are predominantly middle class, educated, and white, Quakers may be more closely identified with those benefiting from empire than those who are victims of empire. If so, a liturgy of resistance may not be a comforting story. A comforting story, a confronting story, can shock us into a new state of being and awareness and lead us back to the center. What do we make of this being washed in the blood of the Lamb? We have generally heard Christians use this phrase as a means of saying that you have been saved in order to not and empathize with those who are crushed by empire. If I were to say that we should be washed in the blood of those lynched and brutalized in our country, it would be a way of saying something like, be continually reminded of those who have paid the ultimate price under this regime. Do not forget them. And let your hearts, your minds, your souls be shaped by the kind of nonviolent resistance that can change this world so that there are no more victims of empire. I think this is the meaning of what Vincent Harding writes at the opening of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. So Jesus' guidance for the disinherited may be available only through some direct, creative, perhaps disguised encounters between those whose wounded backs and spirits testify to the continuing reality of the walls, and those who may no longer be forcibly pressed against them, but who know the walls, and the continuing struggle against those, the house of fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, and have determined to overcome it. In the unofficial, unprivileged, and dangerous encounters at the wall, perhaps that is the way Thurman would prefer us to meet this Jesus at the close of the 20th century. All right, going back to this idea that our liturgies of resistance are not comforting myths, we see them more as a kind of orchestrated detox of empire, a space where we can do the work of unlearning empire. What if that's how we understood liturgy? Imagine if we were caught up in a Nuremberg rally. The rallies are meant to position us against some common enemy. But when someone from the outside of the rally taps us on the shoulder and begins to whisper in our ear that there is another way, that we need to get out of there, listening to that tap begins to wake us up. In 2020, I gave a sermon at our meeting, First Friends. It's a program meeting here in Greensboro. It was the week we learned of the death of Ahmaud Arbery. The young man who was out for a jog was chased down and murdered by a white father and his son. In the talkback session, a person in our meeting said, "Thank you for the message," and that while she really appreciated it, she had to admit that it was jarring and difficult to pay attention to, that she had been avoiding the news, and that this kind of peeled back the layers of the onion for her and made her go deeper into this painful situation, which I think she was admitting she was, maybe unprepared for. Good liturgy is not harsh or hard for the sake of being harsh, but it should not make us and keep us comfortable with empire. Good Quaker liturgy, at least, should help us peel back the layers of empire. This is what James Allison says. Remember, he's a queer Catholic priest and theologian. But I can imagine a Quaker saying this. When people tell me they find Mass boring, I want to say to them, It's supposed to be boring, or at least seriously underwhelming. It's a long-term education in becoming unexcited, since only that will enable us to dwell in a quiet bliss which doesn't abstract from our present or our surroundings or our neighbor, but which increases our attention, our presence, and our appreciation for what is around us. The build-up to a sacrifice is exciting. The dwelling gratitude that the sacrifice has already happened and that we've been forgiven for and through it, and therefore have no more need of sacrifice or scapegoats, is in terms of excitement, a long, drawn-out letdown. We're almost done. So what are some examples of this? These are some suggestions, I think. This is an image of the Poor People's Campaign from 1968 and the mule train that came up from Marks, Mississippi, which was the origin for Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of the Poor People's Campaign. They essentially rode donkeys into the heart of empire, like someone else did a couple thousand years ago. You had Occupy, you have Black Lives Matter, you have today's Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And then I want to say something about the Greensboro Rising, June 7th, 2020. During one of the organized protests for Black Lives Matter here in Greensboro a couple years ago, I was invited along with other white faith leaders to stand on the perimeter of the protests and offer a peaceful presence in case police became violent or things got out of hand. We kind of offer our bodies as a shield. None of that happened, thankfully, due to very good organizing. During that time, there was an opportunity to take communion and sing with some young Black leaders in town. While I do not often participate or partake in communion, given the situation, the leadership present, and the deep pain from the loss of life being memorialized that day, I decided to participate in, learn from, and affirm their work. Here is an excerpt of the liturgy we did around the communion that I am sharing with permission from Reverend Linus Pinkard and Reverend Brandon Rensher. And if I can't think of a liturgy that centers the victims of empire better than this. Leader, today we gather together to remember the crucifixion of Jesus 2,000 years ago, and we proclaim that the crucifixion continues and the body of Christ is black. Today we remember that Jesus was executed by state forces with the help of religious leaders who were threatened by his empowerment of poor and oppressed people. The community response: the ruling powers today are still threatened by poor and oppressed people and their allies. The crucifixion continues and the body of Christ is black. As a Black person, on any given day, you can be killed for simply being Black. Community: no hand in your pockets, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, no walking at night, no walking in the day, no turning onto this street, no entering this building, no standing your ground, no standing here, no standing there, no talking back, no playing with guns, no worshiping God, no living while Black. The crucifixion continues and the body of Christ is black. It only gets, this is just an excerpt, it only gets more difficult and more powerful as it goes. At the end of the responsive prayer, we sang the song, "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" Because as Otis Moss III says in his really great YouTube video, "The Cross and the Lynching of Ahmaud Arbery," he says, singing is itself an act of resistance in the Black church. They took this song, however, and they remixed the words of the old hymn to add these lines. I'm going to show a slide here that is an art piece from Adrian MacDonald. These were some of the lines from the song. that we sang. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when he bled out in the street? Were you there when he said, I cannot breathe? Were you there when he cried, Mama, help me? Were you there when we heard his mother scream? Were you there when the police said, it's not me? Were you there when the DA turned away? Were you there when people filled the streets? Were you there when we stopped the death machine? Let me just pause for a second. I hope that you can see how if that language, those images, was more a part of a liturgy that we participated in, how that would shape us, how that would shape our language, our communities, our imaginations, our practices, our morals, our politics, everything. And so I hope that you see how powerful liturgy can be in building up the capacity for resistance. So in closing, I essentially just want to raise a few questions. I don't know how many on the call are Quakers. I am a Quaker. And so I'm thinking, everything that we've just said tonight, okay, what about Quakers who have an allergy to liturgy and really kind of push away a lot of those things that we might think of as being formative, and not just the comforting stories, but the confronting stories, and where would we build in some of those practices and liturgies to help strengthen or re-strengthen our communities for this work? So Quakers have liturgies as well, whether they are spoken or unspoken. And to consider how friends may embrace this more clearly as powerful practices, a liturgy as powerful practice that can be renewed and redeemed in order to resist empire in our time. How can Quakers be more creative and critical of our liturgies as communal formation? Practices can become corrupted. These practices, which once were born out of the conviction of those resisting empire, out of that logic of the poor and the persecuted, can be taken over and infiltrated by empire. They can be gentrified. They can be sort of made to weakened. So where have Quaker practices become distorted, weakened by empire, infiltrated? But practices can be redeemed, and when not possible, new practices can be developed. Quakers must be alert and aware that all practices go through sequences of decline as well as progress. I think a query like, what do Quakers need to participate in order to be able to be faithful in their resistance to empire, might be helpful. Are there places where Quaker stories, practices, language have lost their ability to wake up Quaker communities to the suffering of their neighbors and peel back the layers of empire at work? Are there places of resistance that are emerging within your meetings, feeling that call to build the multitude and center the victims of empire? One of my main concerns here is, where have Quaker liturgies become repetitive in a way that is no longer helpful? Or what am I trying to say? Diluted. Are we thinking about how to reframe, reinterpret, remix these practices so that they remain alive and connected to who Quakers are, who Quakers want to be? As we close today, I want us to reflect on where our communities and organizations are most susceptible to liturgies of empire, and where renewed Quaker liturgies as powerful practices uh, 18 minutes for questions. So these are just a few ideas. There's many more. Some of these you may like, some of them you may not like. But I was trying to think about what Quaker liturgies as practice might look like, and how we might renew some of these or develop some of these in Quaker communities as a form of resistance. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Wes. That was really extraordinary, and I don't think I fully knew where this presentation was originally gonna, like, where the narrative was gonna lead us, but given I think there's all a lot to consider, and I will certainly be reading your book in the future.
Thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions.
Great.
The first one is about the Tuskegee definition of lynching, which is helpful. And the question is, like many, I once thought it meant only hanging. Maybe you could speak to explaining the modern day lynching that is not hanging. I guess just some context there, if you could offer that.
Yeah, that's a great. I would love for whoever wrote that. If we were, in a different setting, I would say I would love to hear what you have to say about that. I think that lynching. You're right that we think historically about that as being only, if we're thinking in this country, hanging. But I think of state-sanctioned violence, or violence against an individual or a community where the law is essentially like kind of stepping back and allowing it to happen, whether it's legal or not, as being an important part of that context. So when we see, I named a lot of people who I would say are victims of modern day lynchings, and that is in large part because the people who did it got away with it, because people stood around and watched, because it still reflects that. I think as a part of lynching, an important part of that is also that kind of scapegoating, where it's like we've deemed certain individuals or certain groups of people as being bad or less valuable or less human, and so it's okay to do it to them, or there's less consequence. And so to me, I would sort of want to wrap those things up. And that's really, Cone is attaching that kind of framework to, in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He's saying, look, Christians say that they, are really into this guy named Jesus. Well, he was lynched by the Roman state. But then Christians are participating in lynchings, throughout American history. So there's a huge disconnect here. How can you worship somebody who was a victim of empire and then participate in victimizing people? So I think that's kind of the point of his, or one of the points of that book.
Our next question, and I actually have a question I think that builds on this, so I'll get to that after this one. But
great.
The next question is, these liturgies of empire / resistance seem to snowball. Example, consistent violence against Blacks that have led to an increase in many people carrying firearms for protection, which in turn has led to more violence. Is this a common feature of these liturgies of empire, that they in turn lead to liturgies of resistance? And do then those liturgies of resistance in turn become liturgies of empire?
It's a great question. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm thinking mostly about, and this is where again we could develop this idea perhaps, but I guess what I'm kind of trying to sort of hone in on here, largely as liturgies of resistance as being communal practices that form and shape groups, movements. Not to say that there are absolutely practices that we need to do as individuals to inculcate us against empire. But I'm thinking in terms of what are those for, and you can kind of see in this list of things as an example, as I'm lifting up the kind of the communal aspects of what do communities do to build in that capacity, the language, and the ability to stand up to empire. The Poor People's Campaign talks about the evils of empire being systemic racism, poverty, militarism, ecological devastation, and the distorted moral narrative of religious extremism. And like if that is like what American empire looks like today, and I think that's pretty close. We could probably add a few, but that's a pretty good that's a good starting point, anyways. Then what kind of movements and communities do we need to do to not assimilate into that, but to actually stand up against that? And I think we need stronger, more robust communities to be able to do that. I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but I think that's about as good as I can get at the moment.
So my sort of follow-up question to that is, I think reflecting on religion, the religions that the world has experienced to this day, and do you think that there is a inevitability of religion becoming a liturgy of empire once it reaches a certain capacity, mass, for the sake of that religion maintaining control over their constituents, thinking that the Catholic Church was founded on these great principles and then has become so large and powerful that it just seems like there is an inevitability with any religion. If I think back to my religious studies classes at university.
A great question. Let me go bigger first, and that is to say that this is how the way that I understand religion is very broad, and it encompasses all of us, whether we like religion or not. And that is that religio, the root of religion, means to bind together through attitudes, practices, beliefs, and behaviors. To bind people together through practices, behaviors, beliefs. And so where is religio? Who is a part of religio? Well, religio, we see religio in fan groups. We see religio in organizational culture. We see religio in political culture. So anything that binds people together through shared attitudes, practices, beliefs, it functions like a religion or a religio. So I think we think religion in terms of like an organized, 501c, sort of thing. But I'm talking about a sort of like cultural experience that is human and how we form communities. And so I think that I do not think it is inevitable that all religios become empire. I think empire is powerful and wealthy and scary in terms of its its monopoly on violence. But I don't think that it is inevitable. I think that it is hard to not become empire. I think that's to me that's the biblical story, and one of the usefulnesses I think of Hebrew and Christian stories are about the struggle to resist, but that there are examples there of people resisting. There are also examples of people assimilating and giving in, right, and becoming. And so that both of those are true. I think that we are way more susceptible to becoming empire the longer we try to hold on to our organizations and our movements, like, rather than sort of letting them kind of have a kind of a natural life flow and kind of like die and be reborn into different things. When we start to like formalize it and keep it going at all costs, and then it becomes the end in itself rather than a means to an end, that's when it is moving in that dangerous direction. And I think, going back to the person who asked the question before, that's where your practices start to become distorted. And so practices can absolutely become distorted. We can think about examples in which practices flourishing, the practice of medicine flourishing, and we can think about examples where malpractice happens, and I don't want to pick on healthcare, but medical doctors can go the other direction, right, and can abuse their power in the same way that anybody can abuse their power, and turn a practice into an abuse, into sort of an example of empire. So that's kind of the part of the powerful practices that I'm trying to say. The practices aren't just like static and always remain good. They have the kind of decline and hopefully progress, and so that's where, Sean, to your question, I think we have to be in constant negotiation with where are we with these things, and has this thing become no longer viable? Is it now about maintaining the thing rather than being about something greater than itself? One quick example, and I don't know, maybe this is a little bit out of the blue, but there's a Quaker women's organization in the Pacific Northwest called the Quaker Women's Theological Conference that's been meeting for 30 years. And it's women and people who identify as women meet every other year. And they're from a broad theological spectrum, and they're essentially kind of building relationship and dialogue and learning about their expressions of faith under the largest umbrella of Quakers that they can muster. And at the end of every conference, which means every 2 years, they have a business meeting, Sunday afternoon, and they have two questions, and that's it. This is their business meeting, is two questions. Do we do this again? And if so, who's going to lead it? And how many organizations do we have in Quaker meetings where we actually regularly ask ourselves, is there still life here? And is this still doing what it says it's doing? Or is it trying to become something else? And I think that that's a very subtle, but feels like a practice of resistance in a way that is, I love it. I think it's very rare. And, I think maybe I should have put that on my list. Like, do we ask ourselves, is it time to lay this thing down? Anyways, I went too long for that, but it's a great question.
Yeah, and a fascinating answer. I've got one more question, and it's sort of for me, but hopefully you can actually.
Oh, perfect! I would love to hear your answer.
The question is, could Sean reflect on his sense of the meaning or importance of historic Archduke Meeting House's physical location near the origin point of the U.S. Empire, that is Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, and steps away from the Constitution Center, the Museum of the American Revolution, and various other contemporary federal buildings?
Great question. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I'm going to leave that one with you, Sean.
Oh yeah, we are surrounded by empire, and it's weird for sure. Yeah. It's weird as a historian to think back on the founding of Pennsylvania and like try to vaguely interpret what Penn's vision for Pennsylvania was supposed to be. And I'm conflicted. Like it is founded in the root of empire, both I think a faith empire and also the direct British Empire. And thinking that he did a reasonably decent job in trying to establish a set of common law that would protect certain types of people and deliberately certain types of people. But I think specifically about the instance where, you know, you could not have a militia, and then as soon as the Quakers resign from government, then all of a sudden we become essentially a regular colony that is eventually a Pennsylvania, and all those institutions of U.S. empire are now surrounding us. So yeah, it's weird to be in this position, and also to be like in one of the largest meeting houses in the world. There's that weight of what were they doing here when they built this building? Which I think also has elements of empire in it as well. So there's, I can say that's definitely a legacy that we are thinking about as an organization, for sure.
Yeah, I'll put up my last slide if folks are, you know, wanting to see the queries that I had. But I guess I would just say that I don't think there's like any pure place for me as an American outside of empire. I don't think that in this day that that's possible. I think that it's so interwoven. So I don't know, you know, that's not what I'm trying to say, is that there's some like ideal completely outside of the system place that we can stand on and feel good about ourselves. I think what Amy, and kind of what I heard you illustrating is like, are we wrestling with this and thinking about, you know, both complicity in empire, but also how do we form communities that are awake to the suffering of our neighbors and are trying to be in connection with those, as Howard Thurman would say, whose backs are against the wall, and that's most important. To me, that's the important work. It's not to. I don't know if it's possible to be completely outside of it. I certainly haven't figured that piece out or arrived there.
I will say that, you know, being in Philadelphia, we do have the unique experience of being at the center of a lot of these liturgies of resistance, actually, that these places of empire are places where people meet. So like that.
Yeah.
I think we straddle both worlds, you know, in a weird way.
Yeah. I like that. And I like that, you know, what you all are doing and what meetings can do. One thing that meetings can do is providing that, you know, thinking about how do we detox from empire and providing spaces for that to happen, where there is that comforting and confronting stories happening. So yeah, great. Good stuff. And I see my friend Chris Moore's name here. Hey, Chris. Glad you're here.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Wes. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here this evening. I know you had lots of other things to do, so thanks for joining us.
I just want to let everyone know to please keep an eye out for future events, as we'll be hosting more programs over the course of the year. We have created a short survey, and we appreciate your honest thoughts and comments. Kayla should be dropping that link into the chat for folks. And if you would like to join our mailing list, please do. Kayla will also be dropping that in the chat. We've got a host of upcoming events, virtually and in person, over the next couple of months. So we hope to see you. Then. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your evening.
Bye.